The air backstage was thick and heavy, smelling of old wood, floor polish, and a faint electric hum from the stage lights. For the young man standing alone in the narrow hallway, this smell was the smell of possibility. His name was Leo, and at 19 years old, he felt like he was standing on the edge of the entire world. He leaned his shoulder against the cool, slightly textured wall, the solidness of it a small comfort. His long, slender fingers wrapped around the grip of his white cane, his knuckles a little pale from the pressure. He wasn't looking at anything, of course. He hadn't been able to see with his eyes since he was 3 years old. But he was seeing more than most people ever could, seeing with his ears, his hands, and his heart. From his spot behind the heavy velvet curtain, he could feel the concert hall. It was a living, breathing thing. He could feel the low rumble of hundreds of people shifting in their seats, a vibration that traveled up through the soles of his shoes and into his bones. He could hear the sounds, a symphony of its own, a baby's faint cry, quickly hushed, the crinkle of a program being opened, a single, sharp cough from somewhere in the balcony. To anyone else, it was just noise. To Leo, it was a map. He could picture the vast, high ceiling, the rows of red velvet seats stretching back into the darkness, and the stage, a single island of light in a sea of shadows. This was the National Young Virtuoso competition, and tonight, that island was his. His heart was a frantic metronome, beating a quick, nervous rhythm against his ribs. This was it, the moment he had been working toward for as long as he could remember. All those hours, all those days, while other kids were outside playing tag or riding their bikes, he had been at a piano. His childhood hadn't been filled with scraped knees and video games. It had been filled with scales, arpeggios, and the endless pursuit of a perfect note. He didn't regret it, not for a second. Because for Leo, the piano wasn't just an instrument. It was his voice. It was the only way he truly knew how to speak the language swirling inside him. He could feel the weight of what was at stake. The winner wouldn't just get a shiny trophy. They would get a recording contract, a real one, with a major label. And they would get a full scholarship to the most famous music school in the country, a place he had only dreamed about. It was a key that could unlock a future where he wasn't just the blind piano player who was pretty good. He could just be a great piano player. He could prove to everyone, and maybe a little to himself, that his lack of sight wasn't a missing piece. It was just a different way of perceiving the masterpiece. A memory surfaced. It's unbidden, as it often did in these quiet moments before a performance. He was very small, maybe 5 years old, sitting on a wide, worn piano bench next to his father. His father's hands, big and warm, would gently guide his own small fingers over the keys. "Feel that, Leo?" his father would say, his voice soft and low. "This one is C. It feels like home, doesn't it? Solid and strong." And then he would guide his hand to another key. "And this one, this G, it's like a question, always wanting to go somewhere else." His father had taught him that music wasn't just about sound. It was about feeling, about stories, about colors he couldn't see but could understand perfectly. A C-sharp wasn't just a note. It was a bright, silver light. An F minor chord was a deep, dark blue. His father had given him a world of color in a world of darkness. Taking a deep breath, Leo pushed the memory away and focused back on the present. He could hear the muffled voice of the announcer on stage introducing the current contestant. Then came the sound of applause, polite but not overwhelming. He listened to the music that followed. It was good, technically perfect. The notes were all in the right place, the rhythm was precise, but it felt empty. It was like looking at a beautifully painted photograph of a person, but not being able to see their soul. Leo knew he could do more than that. He didn't just want to play the notes on the page. He wanted to tell the story behind them. He wanted to make the audience feel the ache of a sad melody and the pure joy of a soaring crescendo. He wanted them to feel what he felt. The music ended, and another wave of applause filled the hall, a little louder this time. He heard the soft thud of footsteps as the contestant walked off the stage. Passing by him in the hallway with a faint rustle of fabric, there was a moment of silence, a pause that felt heavier than all the noise before it. This was it, his turn. The announcer's voice boomed through the hall again, clear and strong. It was time. Leo straightened up, letting go of the wall. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, a small, nervous gesture. He could feel the eyes of the world on him, even though he couldn't see them. He took one last deep breath, the air tasting of anticipation and dust. He tapped his white cane on the floor, finding his path forward. The first step was the hardest, but he took it, moving out of the darkness of the wings and toward the light. The urge to run was a physical force, pulling at his muscles, telling him to get up, to flee the stage and the crushing weight of 1,000 stairs. But his fingers, still resting on the polished wood of the piano, held him in place. They felt the deep, silent history of the instrument, the countless songs it had sung, the hands that had played it before him. In that touch, a memory of his father's voice surfaced, clear as a bell. The music isn't in the keys, Leo. It's in you. The piano is just the way you let it out. The judge had taken away the keys, but he couldn't take away the music. A slow, quiet strength began to replace the cold dread in his chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something deeper, a quiet decision that he would not be shamed. He would not be made to feel small. Not on his stage. Instead of pushing himself up to leave, he did the opposite. He took a deep, slow breath, and as he let it out, he straightened his back. It was a small movement, but it changed everything. His shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, squared. He was no longer a boy being scolded. He was a musician. Then, with a deliberate, unhurried motion, he turned his body on the bench. He pivoted away from the judge's table, away from the man who had tried to break him, and faced the audience. He couldn't see their faces, but he could feel their collective gaze, a wall of heat and confusion. He was showing them and the judges that his performance was not for a panel. It was for them. The people, the ones who came to listen. The hall was so quiet now that he could hear the faint, distant hum of the city outside. The audience didn't know what to expect. Was he going to speak? To argue? To beg? Leo did none of those things. He simply sat, facing them, a calm stillness about him that was more powerful than any outburst could have been. Then he leaned forward. With a gentleness that was almost reverent, he placed both of his hands flat on the closed wooden lid of the grand piano. The smooth, cool surface was a familiar friend. And then he began to play. At first, there was only confusion. A few people in the front rows tilted their heads, squinting. What was he doing? His hands were on the lid, not the keys. But as his fingers began to move, a strange and beautiful thing started to happen. He was playing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, the piece he had prepared. His fingers danced across the smooth, silent wood, pressing down where the thunderous opening chords should have been. There was no sound, but there was music. The audience could see it in the arch of his fingers, the force of his hands as they hammered out the imaginary notes. They could see it in his face. His eyes, though sightless, were closed in deep concentration. His brow furrowed with the effort of the complex passages. His lips parted slightly, as if he were humming the melody himself. His hands were a blur of motion, flying up and down the length of the lid with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. They were no longer just hands. They were the entire orchestra. In the fast, intricate middle section, his fingers scampered like spiders, light and impossibly quick. The people watching found themselves leaning forward, their own fingers twitching, imagining the sound. They could almost hear the cascading notes. The storm of sound that his body was so clearly creating, the silence in the concert hall transformed. It was no longer a tense, awkward silence. It became sacred. No one coughed. No one rustled a program. Hundreds of people were holding their breath, completely captivated by this silent, powerful performance. They were witnessing something they had never seen before. It was pure, unfiltered emotion, stripped down to its most essential form. There were no notes to get in the way, no sound to distract from the raw passion on the young man's face. He wasn't just playing the piano. He was conducting a symphony with his soul, and they were the only ones who could see it. A woman in the third row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, deeply moved by a piece of music she couldn't even hear. An old man, a music teacher for 50 years, watched with his mouth slightly agape, realizing he was seeing the very definition of artistry. The head judge, Alistair, sat stiffly in his chair, his face a stony mask. But even he could not look away. Leo was lost in his own world, a world of sound and color that only he could perceive. The polished wood beneath his fingers was no longer just wood. It was the landscape of his music. He could feel the vibrations of the imaginary chords traveling up his arms. He could see the bright silver flash of the high notes and the deep dark blue of the bass notes in his mind's eye. The humiliation from moments before had burned away, replaced by a pure white-hot joy. He was playing. He was finally truly playing. He was showing them that music wasn't about what you see or hear with your ears. It was about what you feel. And what he was feeling, and what he was making them feel, was more real than any sound. The piece built toward its dramatic climax. His movements became larger, more forceful. His whole body swayed with the rhythm, his shoulders rising and falling with the crescendos only he could hear. His hands flew across the lid, pounding out the final, crashing chords with an intensity that seemed to shake the very air. And then, as the final powerful note should have rung out and faded into silence, his hands stopped. He held them aloft over the wooden lid, frozen for a single, perfect moment, a statue of pure musical triumph. The performance was over. For a long, breathless second, the entire concert hall remained in that sacred silence. Everyone still caught in the spell he had woven. The boy on the stage, with his hands held high, had just given them the most unforgettable performance of their lives, without playing a single note. The tap of his cane on the wooden stage was a steady, confident beat. Each step was measured, a familiar dance he had performed 1,000 times in his mind. The heat from the spotlights washed over him, a warm blanket that pushed back the cool air of the hall. It felt like a promise. He could sense the vastness of the space in front of him, the sheer number of people, their collective silence a heavy, expectant thing. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full, brimming with curiosity, and the hope of being moved by something beautiful. He walked toward the center of the light, toward the shape he knew so well, the elegant curve of the grand piano. His fingers found the smooth, cool surface of the bench, and he ran his hand along it to find its center. With a soft, practiced motion, he sat down, the bench letting out a tiny, familiar creak. He was home. For a moment he just sat there, his hands resting in his lap. He let the atmosphere soak into him. He could smell the faint, clean scent of the piano's polish and the old wood of the stage itself. He could feel the vibrations of his own heart, a drum solo of nervous energy. He lifted his hands and let them hover over the keys, not quite touching them. He didn't need to see them. He knew every single one by its feel, by its space. The slight dip of the white keys, the cool raised ridge of the black ones. They were old friends. He could feel the electricity building in the air, the audience leaning forward in their seats, waiting. He was ready to pour his soul out, to tell them a story with 88 keys. He took a final, silent breath, and was about to let his fingers find their first note when a voice cut through the silence like a shard of glass. Stop. The voice was not loud, but it was sharp and cold, carrying an authority that chilled the warm air. It came from the direction of the long table where the judges sat. Leo froze, his hands suspended in the air just above the keys. The audience, too, seemed to hold its breath. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer expectant. It was confused, tense. The voice spoke again, and this time Leo could place it. It belonged to the head judge, a man whose reputation for being brutally traditional had preceded him. Leo had never met him, had only heard stories, but he recognized the tone instantly. It was the voice of someone who believed rules were more important than people. "Young man," the voice said, each word clipped and precise. "We need to address a matter of protocol before you begin." Leo remained still, his hands slowly lowering to his lap. A knot of confusion began to tighten in his stomach. Protocol. What protocol could there be? He had followed every rule, every instruction he had been given. He had arrived on time. He had dressed appropriately. He was ready to perform the piece he had spent months perfecting. There was a shuffling of papers from the judge's table, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the dead quiet hall. Then the cold voice continued. It has come to our attention, and upon review, that a key regulation of this competition has been overlooked. A regulation, I might add, that is fundamental to the spirit of this event. The judge paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The rules state very clearly that a performer must demonstrate a complete command of the stage, which includes a direct and engaging stage presence. A connection with the audience, visually, is paramount. Leo felt the blood begin to drain from his face. He knew where this was going. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, started to creep up from his chest. "Now, due to your condition," the judge said, the word condition hanging in the air like an insult. "You are unable to fulfill this most basic requirement. You cannot make eye contact. You cannot use body language to convey the emotion of the piece alongside the music. Therefore, it is with regret that I must inform you that you are disqualified from this competition. You will not be permitted to play." The words hit Leo like a physical blow. It was a punch to the gut, stealing his breath. For a second, the world went completely silent. He couldn't hear the audience, couldn't feel the lights, couldn't even feel his own heart beating. All he could hear was those words echoing in his head. Not allowed to play. The one thing in the world he was born to do, and he was being told he couldn't do it. Not because he wasn't good enough. Not because his music lacked soul. But because he couldn't see. A wave of humiliation so intense, it made him feel physically sick washed over him. He had come here to prove that his blindness was not a weakness. He wanted to show everyone that music was more than just what you could see. And now, that very blindness was being used as a weapon against him. Public declaration that he was less than, that he was incomplete. The heat from the spotlights suddenly felt cold and harsh, exposing him. He could feel the thousands of eyes on him, but they weren't looking at a musician anymore. They were looking at a charity case, a boy who had just been publicly shamed. He could hear it now, the sound from the crowd. It wasn't a single gasp, but a collective, sharp intake of breath, followed by a low, angry murmur that spread through the hall like a wildfire. It was the sound of confusion turning to outrage on his behalf, but their anger only made his shame burn hotter. He didn't want their pity. He wanted his chance. He sat there, frozen on the bench, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. Every sacrifice he had ever made flashed before his eyes. The lonely hours practicing while friends were outside, the frustration of learning a piece by braille, note by painful note, the unwavering faith his father had put in him, telling him he could move the world with his music. It all felt like a lie now, a cruel joke. He had been a fool to think he could ever belong in their world, a world built on things he could not see. The judge's final dismissive words were a death sentence to his dream. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and be gone forever. He was just about to push himself up from the bench, to accept his defeat and retreat back into the darkness, when his fingers brushed against the smooth, polished wood of the piano lid, and in that touch, something inside him shifted. It was a tiny spark, a flicker of defiance in a sea of despair. This was his piano. This was his world. And no one, not even a cold-hearted man with a rulebook, could take that away from him. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. He was going to show them. His hands came to a rest, hovering for a split second over the smooth, unyielding wood before settling gently on its surface. The final, imaginary chord hung in the air, a silent scream of defiance and passion. His chest was heaving, each breath a ragged pull of air. His forearms ached with a fire he had never felt before, a burn that came not from striking keys, but from pouring every ounce of his being into a performance no one could hear. He was completely exposed, a raw nerve ending vibrating under the hot lights. He had done it. He had spoken his truth without making a sound, and now he waited for the verdict. He waited for the laughter, the pity, the final, crushing confirmation that he was just a fool who had made a spectacle of himself. But the silence that followed was not what he expected. It wasn't an empty or awkward silence. It was a heavy, thick, profound silence. It was the silence of 1,000 minds trying to process what they had just seen. It was the silence of hearts that had been touched by a language they didn't know they could understand. Leo could feel it pressing in on him, a physical weight. He sat perfectly still, his head bowed, listening with his entire body. He could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. The tension was gone, replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite name. It was like the entire hall was holding its breath along with him. He strained his ears, trying to catch a single whisper, a rustle, a cough, anything to break the spell and tell him what they were thinking. But there was nothing. Just a deep, resonant quiet that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. In that quiet, Leo felt a strange sense of peace. He had said what he needed to say. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. Then it came. A single sound, sharp and clear, cutting through the stillness like a bell. Clap. It was just one person. One pair of hands meeting together in the vast, silent space. The sound was so isolated, so brave, that it made Leo flinch. He had been expecting a wave of noise, but this was different. This was a choice. Someone was choosing to break the silence, to be the first to respond. Another beat passed. Clap, clap, clap. The same person, clapping slowly, deliberately. Each clap echoed slightly in the hall, a steady, confident rhythm. Leo turned his head slightly in the direction of the sound, trying to pinpoint it. It seemed to come from the front rows, from an old soul who had perhaps seen enough of the world to recognize true courage when he saw it. That slow, steady clap was a seed, and in the fertile ground of the audience's stunned hearts, it began to grow. A second person joined in, then a third. Soon, a small section of the front row was clapping in that same slow, rhythmic way. It was no longer just applause. It was a statement. It was an acknowledgement. It was the crowd saying, "We see you. We understand." Then, like a dam breaking, the rhythm changed. The slow clap quickened, and other people all over the hall began to join in, their claps faster, more urgent. The sound grew from a trickle to a stream, then to a roaring river. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated sound washing over the stage, filling every corner of the hall. It was a thunderous, deafening ovation. Leo could feel it in the floorboards, a deep, powerful vibration that traveled up his legs and into his chest. He could feel the air itself thrumming with the energy of 1,000 people on their feet, their applause not for a perfect performance, but for a perfect human spirit. He sat there, his head still bowed, letting the sound crash over him. He had never heard anything so beautiful in his entire life. It was the sound of acceptance. It was the sound of victory. A tear escaped from the corner of his eye and traced a warm path down his cheek. He wasn't crying from sadness or from humiliation. He was crying from an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They had understood. They had truly understood. Through the wall of sound, he heard a new sound. The soft, quick footsteps of someone approaching the stage. He tensed for a moment, afraid it was the head judge coming to drag him away. But the footsteps were light, not heavy and judgmental. They stopped right beside him. He felt a presence, a gentle warmth next to the piano. Then he heard a soft, feminine voice close to his ear. "Play for us," she whispered. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. He felt a hand reach over his shoulder, not touching him, but reaching for the piano lid. There was a soft click, a creak of a hinge, and then a heavy, resonant thump as the lid was lifted and propped open. The smell of wood and felt and dust rose up to meet him. It was the smell of possibility. The invitation was clear. Leo took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with the sound of the crowd's applause. He nodded slowly, a small gesture of thanks to the person who had given him back his voice. He turned his body back to the keys, his hands finding them as if by instinct. They were no longer just friends. They were his salvation. He placed his fingers on the keys, the cool ivory a welcome, familiar feeling under his fingertips. He didn't need to think about what to play. The music was already there, waiting. He began. The first notes were soft, hesitant, like a question asked in a quiet room. They were the notes of his heartbreak, his humiliation from just moments before. The melody was fragile and sad, and a hush fell over the crowd as they leaned in to listen. But then, the music began to change. It grew stronger, more complex. It was the sound of his anger, his defiance. The chords became more powerful, the rhythm more insistent. It was the story of his silent performance, the fury and the passion he had poured into the wood of the piano lid. And then, just as the music reached a fever pitch, it broke. It soared into a melody so full of hope and joy and triumph that it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. It was the sound of the applause, the sound of their acceptance, the sound of his own spirit refusing to be broken. He played with a freedom he had never felt before, his fingers flying across the keys. Not just playing the notes, but pouring his entire soul into every single one. He was no longer just a blind boy playing a piano. He was a storyteller, and his story was bringing the entire world to its feet, not just in applause, but in tears. The final note didn't just end. It dissolved into the air, leaving a space so full of emotion it felt like the music was still there, just invisible. The last vibration faded from the piano strings, but the feeling it left behind hung in the hall like a warm, heavy mist. For a long moment, there was no sound at all. The thunderous applause had died down, replaced by something quieter and much deeper. It was the sound of 1,000 people catching their breath, the soft rustle of tissues, the muffled sound of quiet sobs. They were not crying from sadness, but from being touched in a place they didn't know they had. Leo sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his entire body feeling light and empty, as if he had poured everything he was into the music and had nothing left. He slowly lifted his hands and placed them in his lap. His head was bowed, not in shame this time, but in a state of quiet exhaustion and profound peace. He had done it. He had spoken his truth, and they had listened. They had truly listened. He could feel the change in the room. It was no longer a concert hall full of strangers watching a competition. It was a community of people who had just shared a deeply human experience. He had connected with them not through his eyes, but through his soul, and in that connection, he had found a kind of victory he had never even known to look for. Then, a different sound broke the spell. It was the sharp, deliberate tap of a gavel. The sound was jarring, cold, and completely out of place. It was the sound of the world crashing back in. The head judge, Alistair Finch, had called the room back to order. His voice, when it came, was as flat and emotionless as it had been before. It was as if he had been in a different room, as if the music that had just filled the hall had been nothing more than background noise to him. He thanked the contestants for their participation and, with a complete lack of feeling, announced the third-place runner-up. A smattering of polite applause followed. Then he announced the second-place runner-up. The applause was a little louder, but it felt hollow and forced. Finally, he announced the winner of the National Young Virtuoso competition. The name he spoke meant nothing to Leo. It was just a sound. A collection of syllables that had no connection to the reality of what had just happened on that stage. The winner's music had been technically perfect, but it was a ghost compared to the living, breathing thing Leo had just created. As the winner's music was played over the speakers, a few people clapped, but it was a weak, confused sound. Most of the audience just sat there, looking at the stage. At the young man who hadn't won the trophy, but had won their hearts, Leo felt no disappointment, no sting of defeat. He realized with a startling clarity that the trophy was meaningless. It was a piece of metal and wood. It couldn't hold a single note of the music he had just played. It couldn't measure the weight of a single tear in the audience. He had already won. When it was time to leave the stage, he stood up slowly, his legs feeling a little unsteady. He found his cane and tapped his way toward the wings, but this time the walk was completely different. The silence from the judges' table felt distant and unimportant. What he felt from the crowd was a wave of pure, unadulterated respect. As he stepped off the stage into the darkness, a stagehand who had been standing there didn't just move out of his way. He reached out and gently squeezed Leo's shoulder. A silent, simple gesture that said more than words ever could. Backstage, the other contestants, who had been his rivals just an hour ago, looked at him with awe. No one spoke. They just made a path for him, their faces filled with a mixture of admiration and humility. He was no longer an outsider. He was the one they all measured themselves against. He found a quiet corner and sat down on an old equipment case. The adrenaline finally leaving his body, leaving him feeling drained and wonderfully empty. He just wanted to be alone for a moment, to process everything that had happened. He heard footsteps approaching, but he didn't look up, assuming it was just someone passing by. But the footsteps stopped right in front of him. An older, gentle voice spoke. "That was the most honest performance I have ever heard." Leo lifted his head. He couldn't see the man, but he could hear the kindness in his voice, the deep, resonant tone of someone who had lived a full life. "Thank you," Leo said, his voice a little hoarse. The man continued, "I have been a conductor for over 50 years. I have worked with the best musicians in the world, and I have never, not once, felt music the way I felt it tonight. You didn't just play the piano. You reminded us all why we listen to music in the first place." Leo didn't know what to say. He just sat there, listening. "They may not have given you their trophy," the man said, his voice softening, "but you have earned something far more valuable. You have earned the respect of everyone who was lucky enough to be here." He paused, and then he said the words that would change Leo's life forever. "My symphony is touring the country next season. We have a date in this very hall. I would be more than honored if you would consider being our soloist. No competition. No judges. Just you and the piano and the music. What do you say?" In the months that followed, the story of the boy who was not allowed to play spread like wildfire. Someone in the audience had recorded the silent performance on their phone, and the video went viral. People all over the world watched in stunned silence as a young man poured his heart out on a closed piano lid. They saw his defiance, his passion, and they were moved. He became a symbol of the power of the human spirit to overcome prejudice and to create beauty in the face of cruelty. And so, Leo found himself on another stage, in another city. This hall was even bigger than the first. The air was thick with the same anticipation, but this time it was all for him. There was no panel of judges, no rulebook, no chance of being disqualified. There was only a sold-out crowd of people who had come to hear him play. As he walked out onto the stage, the applause that greeted him was not polite or reserved. It was a roar, a celebration of his journey. He found the piano bench and sat down, his heart calm and steady. He was no longer a nervous contestant on the edge of the world. He was a master, and the whole world was finally listening. He placed his fingers on the keys, and as he began to play, he knew that the music that had almost been silenced was now a voice that would be heard all over the world.